Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Anthony Belov. I'm the chair of the program committee here at Salmagundi, and it's my pleasure always to introduce one of my dearest friends, Alex Katlan. I know he knows I'm lying. Alex is a longtime member, 1983? 1982. He starts arguing with me right away. 1982. And apart from his amazing encyclopedic knowledge about just the history of art and painting techniques in general, especially oil, is that safe to say? Alex happens to be an outstanding painting conservator. He's very highly regarded in the field. And for many years, he served as the chair of the library committee. So if you're ever in the library and he walks in, leave. Because we will start talking and never stop. Alex is also extremely authoritative about the history of the building itself and specifically of the club. So, did I cover everything?
Yes, you did.
All right.
Thank you.
Put your hands together for Alex.
Thank you very much for all the things. As Anthony said, I'm a painting conservator, have been for many, many years, and it is really sort of the reason I joined the club in '82, because, and may I sit down because I hurt my lower back and standing is a chore, actually. But I joined the club in '82 because one of the things, I was conserving paintings, I ran across labels from the Salmagundi Club auctions or the Salmagundi Club thumb box exhibitions. These were smaller paintings that they had thumb box exhibitions starting in 1908. And I wanted to know, I called the curators committee, and I wanted to know, they had the name of the artist and the title, but there was no date, and there was no date on the painting. So I called the club, and they told me very nicely that unfortunately they are a volunteer organization and they have no time to research the history of these old paintings. So I joined the club in '82 and started my research, which is why I was one of the first historians for the club. I'm going to start with Salvador Mundi before treatment. How many of you have seen Salvador Mundi, the painting by Leonardo da Vinci, attributed to Leonardo da Vinci, before it was restored? Okay. And you can see that I wanted to put this in there because I want to talk about the importance of artist materials and how it relates to the authentication process. Hi there. The authentication process and how it is influencing the authentication process. So here is the condition of the Salvador Mundi after all the old restoration was removed from it. And notice that since most authentication is done based on stylistic techniques, that in this painting it is so extensively damaged, the hair, the eyes, the chin, this whole background here. And so the only parts of the painting that are really still intact are the hands and the shoulder over here. And if you look, this is it after conservation. Well, of course, this looks like a Leonardo, but it's based on the interpretation of the conservator that put it together. And you can notice that the chin is redone, and the eyes are redone, and the hair is redone. Well, there has been some debate based on the stylistic qualities of the hand and the curls in the hair that this may not be by Leonardo. So the Louvre published from the Conservation Lab some pigment analysis that they did, a cross-sectional work. And I don't have an example of that because it was published on the Louvre website and then withdrawn within a week. So I was not able to get a photograph of it. But here is Raphael, and here you have a sample, a cross-sectional sample of what a cross-section is. Here is the paint layers and varnish layers, and then this is the ground layer. And notice that there is no glass in that support. And here is a follower of Leonardo, and this is actually a copy of Christ from 1911. And if you look at the cross-sectional work here, you can see that there is glass fragments in the ground layer here. And this is in this layer here, as well as in the paint layer here. Well, that's very unusual because all the other Leonardo paintings do not have glass in the ground layer. And glass was used by many of the Italian artists in the 1500s because of the influence of Venice and the glassmakers in Venice. But it was not typical of Leonardo. And here is an example of another follower of Leonardo, and it shows you a cross-section which does not have glass. Now, I want to show you what a cross-section is, and it is a destructive process where you take a micron of pigment and you embed it into a plastic, and then you grind it down. So here are some cross-sections. If you look at the size of it, you can see the actual size of the pigment that is taken. It's not a large section of paint. It's just a micron of paint. You can pass that around. So the Louvre, when they did the cross-section of the Salmagundi, found glass in the ground. And it was withdrawn because of that, because it raises the question of who actually did the work. And so this debate on Salmagundi is going to continue for decades, if not for centuries. And it's going to be, it's unclear whether Leonardo was experimenting, whether this is a follower of Leonardo, but because the painting is so damaged, so fragmented from the losses, that you cannot really do an authentication based on style. And I wanted to show you that because I felt that was an important way of introducing you to the history of art materials and how they are used in authentication. Understand that scientific analysis of the pigments, of the ground, of the canvas or the panel or even dendrochronology, none of that tells you that it is a painting by Leonardo. What it tells you is that it's from the period, a time frame, a parameter of time. It does not give you a specification to a specific artist. So conservators or conservation scientists cannot actually authenticate. And we do not authenticate. It is the art historians and the curators that do so. This here is an etching from the early 1400s. And I wanted to show you a typical bottega of an Italian bottega of how artists learned their craft of painting. And if you notice in here, these are young people here. And over here, this is not a midget. This is a young child. So why are young children being part of this bottega of art where they're studying art? Because these young people were indentured into these art bottegas, and this is how they learned the craft of painting. And you have to remember, in 1400s, life was very precarious, and many of these artists died in their teens, in their 20s, and so on. And I wanted to show you an example of that. Here is the Brancacci Chapel, the tribute money by Masaccio. His real name was Tommaso di Simone. And he dies at the age of 28. This chapel was done when he was 17. Imagine that today, okay? And this created the whole movement to naturalism in the Renaissance. And this chapel, and you can see in terms of, this is a fresco, and you can see the naturalism in the painting. Now, here is an engraving about 100 years later. It's the end of the 1500s. Well, notice the difference. You still have, these are not midgets as I said, you still have these very young children indentured, but notice what they're painting on. Instead of a panel painting, what is this? It's canvas. You can see it's canvas because you can see the tacks that are holding the canvas to the support. Yes?
So where was this?
This is about the end of the 1500s.
And where? Do we know?
This is Italian also, okay?
Exactly.
And the maestro is doing the large painting. They are grinding paint over here. The young students are learning from casts. And over here is the teenage artist that's gone through the whole process doing portraiture. And the reason I'm pointing this out is to show you how canvas painting was introduced. Initially, those tacks that were in the support, holding the canvas to the edge of the support, of the strainer, were all hand forged because they didn't have manufacturing. So each tack had to be handmade, and they're rose head tacks. It was very, very expensive to create tacks. So their solution was a lacing canvas to a strainer or a frame. Now this is before stretchers were actually invented. So at the end of the 1500s, or, you know, I shouldn't say that. It's actually canvas was introduced through Venice and as early as the late 1400s. But its popularity doesn't really come into play until oil painting was developed. Now, what did they use to paint before oil painting was invented? Okay, and what is tempera paint? Egg yolk. And why is tempera paint not suitable for canvas?
It's fugitive.
Fugitive?
Yes.
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily. It's right. But what is the problem with canvas opposed to panel and tempera opposed to oil?
Flex.
No.
Flexibility. And tempera, when it dries, becomes very brittle, which is why when it's on panel, it's perfectly fine. But as soon as you put it on a canvas support, the canvas is flexible, and if it's all tempera, it will fracture or crack. So the invention of oil, or the introduction of oil painting, and the reason they introduced oil is because tempera dries very rapidly. Oil dries slowly, and so you can blend the colors or blend tonal values. And Leonardo, what was the famous saying that Leonardo created in terms of his darks? chiaroscuro. And what does that mean, chiaroscuro? Clear darks. And why is that so important? Because with tempera, when you create a dark, the only way you can create an intense dark is by hatching, by cross-hatching, because the tempera dries very rapidly. With oil, you can create these darks by blending the darks, and so they're clear darks. And the reason this develops between 1400 and the late 1500s is because what happened is they started to add oil to the tempera paint to retard the drying of the tempera. So by adding more and more oil, they eventually made it 100% oil paint. And of course, what is the oil that they were using?
In Italy, olive?
Not olive oil.
Linseed oil.
Linseed oil. And why is it linseed?
I have different explanation, but
Okay, well, you don't have to
I
answer.
think you should ask.
Anthony, why linseed?
Okay, I don't know the answer, but I'm going to guess that there was a compatibility between linseed oil and a water-based product like egg.
No.
Okay.
So it's probably
Okay, the compatibility, it is a compatibility, but let me go on. The compatibility is what is canvas made out of?
Oh.
Canvas is made out of linen. What is linseed oil made out of?
Linen seeds.
The seed of the linen plant or the flax plant. So there is a compatibility between the oil, the linseed oil that was used, and the linen canvas. And that is why linen is so stable. This shows you the lacing of the canvas and then the tacking of the canvas over here. I'm sorry, I'm going. And this is a detail from an old master painting, and you can see it's actually laced by gut, and the frame that's holding it is glued or nailed or doweled in the corners. It is not expandable. So when the canvas starts relaxing and buckling a bit, all they did was to retighten the gut or the lacing that was holding the canvas. Now, there are very few paintings that still are laced. There's only about one or two remaining in the world. I think it's in Europe, in the Rijksmuseum. And they actually made frames that went over the lacing so you wouldn't see it. And the frame, the ornate frame, would cover the edges because there was no tacking edge at that time. This is a Titian on canvas. It shows you the introduction of canvas very early. And Titian left the ground visible in this background. It was a reddish ground instead of a white ground. Now, I wanted to show you some polarized light microscopy that I took of linen fiber. And notice that these nodules and the thick cell wall that is around the linen fiber. It is why linen survives for centuries. And here is another example of it. And here is a cotton fiber. So why didn't they paint with cotton instead of linen? And there was cotton known from Egyptian times. But you cannot use oil on cotton. Because if you use oil directly onto cotton, the thin cell wall, this is very thin, this cell wall, it will rot the cellulose of the cotton. It is the reason when cotton duck was introduced in the 50s, Rothko and Pollock and many of these other artists painted, they loved the white tone of the cotton duck. So they painted directly on the cotton duck without any kind of sizing, without any kind of ground, because they wanted the white texture of the cotton duck. Well, the result is that now, decades later, the Rothkos that used turpentine and oil actually has rotted the canvas, and you can see the discoloration of the canvases at the back. And it's one of the reasons why the Rothko Foundation and the Pollock Foundation have restricted the traveling of many of these paintings because of the instability of them. So, and here we have different kinds of fabrics. In the 19th century, they would have different kinds of weaves for different purposes, maritimes, portraiture, and this is an example of that. And here is a cross-section. It is in this cross-section that you can see when there is a problem with a painting. It usually comes from the canvas up, the cracking, or unless it's a technical flaw. And this is the paint layer here, and here is the varnish layer, and here is a glaze over here, and this is the ground layer here. And I wanted to show you why paintings survive. So here is the paint. When you apply paint to a canvas and it's wet, it is this layer here. It is, you can see it's very thick, it's fluid, it's flowing, it's flexible. As the oil polymerizes or oxidizes, it shrinks down and becomes harder and harder. It becomes crystalline. And that is the reason oil paintings survive. Because if it was still this flexible, it would be soft and not survive. It is because it oxidizes and dries that it becomes solid or rock-like. And it is that rock-like structure that actually causes the painting to crack. Because say this is canvas, the support is canvas, and you're painting with oil on top of that. What happens with canvas when it is in the open environment? You have temperature, you have humidity, you have sunlight. All of this affects the canvas. The canvas absorbs humidity, it expands, it contracts. What happens when you have a rock-like structure on top of a flexible support? Something has to give. And what gives is a crack formed from the canvas up into the paint. And this forms a craquelure or a crackle pattern in the painting. It is why you see tension cracking and so on. Here is an example of a cracking, a typical craquelure pattern in a 19th century painting from, I think it was 1876. And you notice that the pigment here, the pigment layer, that you can see the particle grains of the pigment, that it's very rough ground pigment. This is very typical of 19th century pigment. And this is important because this is ultramarine blue, lapis lazuli, and you can see the pigment particles are conchoidal, they're different sizes, they're different dimensions, and this gives a certain luminosity to the mineral pigments. This here is that artificial ultramarine blue. And if you look at the pigment particles, you can see that this is all uniform. It is all small particle sizes. And this is why in the 19th century, with the development of artificial pigments, ultramarine blue and the cadmiums and cobalts and so on, that the pigment particles, they purposely made them small because they didn't want it settling in the tubes of color that were available at the time. Okay? And so I touched on this. when I was talking about canvas. But the earliest supports were a strainer, which is this here, and you can see it's either glued or doweled. The invention of a key in the corner or a double key, a single key comes in with a stretcher that was developed in my wallet. I'm dropping everything.
Should put it there. So
Never mind. So the single key stretcher was probably developed in France in the 1800s, not before then. And it is the double key stretcher that comes in the 19th century. The earliest kinds of stretcher were based on ship construction, and this is a shiplap, a very square corner. This miter corner, this that you see here that we know on stretchers today, all artists assume that that was always invented. It wasn't. This was developed in 1884-85 by the man's name who was Fleger. He took out a patent, and that is when the beveled corner, the mitered corner, and the bevel stretcher was introduced. So what we assume as always being available to artists is a series of inventions that changed over time.
may I ask you a question?
Yes, please.
I come back just a few minutes before when we were talking about linen quickly. When you compare cotton and linen,
Yes.
you said you had to use linen because the oxidation of the oil would damage, the
Right.
cotton, would make the
Yeah.
cotton rot, but wouldn't make the linen rot also, but less?
No, because it's linseed, and the seed of the linen plant, the linen is made from the same plant, and so it doesn't rot the plant.
So let me put it this.
So if you use walnut oil,
it wouldn't work.
it can rot
Yeah.
because it's a bit more acidic. But because they use a ground layer and size the linen, the sizing and the ground is to protect the linen from other kinds
I
of
understand,
oil.
but my point to go down now, because so today, if you use a paint ground in linseed oil,
Yes.
you could possibly paint directly without sizing on linen, and it would be permanent.
That's why I showed you the Titian, because that's exactly what happened there.
Okay, so that's very good because I think many people don't see that difference.
Now, when I said that cotton, that if you use oil on cotton, that it creates a problem. That is, if the cotton is not sized or does not have a ground layer. If it has a ground layer and is sized, that protects the cotton fiber from the oil, and eventually it'll penetrate into the ground, but it will not cause the canvas to rot. So many artists have used cotton duck with oil paint, but also notice when cotton was really popular during World War II, and the reason it became popular is because of the wars, World War I and II, where they could not import linen because of the wars. So they introduced cotton, and then they introduced acrylic paint, which was suitable for cotton.
So, and other quick question, or just confirmation, starting on using linen canvas in Italy, particularly in Venice, isn't it also because the linen was used for sails, for the sails of the sails boat, particularly in Venice, and that's how they reused the linen.
I'm so glad you brought that up. Okay, so I showed you different weaves of canvas. Well, in Italy, this is not true of Northern Europe and the Dutch, Flanders or Holland. In Italy, the introduction of canvas comes into Venice. Why? Why does it go into into Venice? It goes into Venice because Rome and Florence and Siena are creating these large frescoes in the churches to the glory of God and so on. And these large murals, Venice tried to do. The Doges tried to create frescoes in Venice. But why did they not survive in Venice?
Too damp.
Okay, it's damp, but there's another reason. It wasn't just damp, it was salt.
Oh.
And what destroys fresco is not just moisture, but salt, which fractures the silica bond that is holding the pigment. And so 20 years after frescoes were created in Venice, these frescoes were falling apart. Even Leonardo tried to do frescoes in Venice, and they were unsuccessful. So they turned, the Doges wanted to compete with Florence and Rome to the glory of their city-state and so on, to show that they were very wealthy, and so they turned to what they had in the harbor, which were these boats, these sails. And how were the sails attached to the boom and the mast? It was not metal cleats, it was laced. So the first canvases that come into Italy are not nailed, they're laced, that you saw. So it is directly from the sailcloths or the sails of the fleet in Venice. Now, let me just finish. The type of sail was a very thick linen that was herringbone pattern. And so the earliest linens that were first used was not a tabby woven canvas, but a herringbone canvas.
What does it mean, herringbone?
Herringbone is
Like
like
this.
a
flourish.
like this. Okay? A herringbone canvas where instead of a tabby like this, it's this shape. And that's because it was stronger as a sailcloth. Okay? Now, did I answer your question?
Yep.
Okay, we have a question here.
Were they painting their sails before they turned them into...
I don't know that. That's a very good question. Whether they put the names of the commercial fleets on the... that would be something to check.
Like Columbus
Well, it's
had the
both.
crosses on it.
Yeah, exactly. And that was probably
Like,
painted.
all right, wait, if we
Yeah.
put these in a smaller form.
Yeah.
It's both. Depends.
Depends.
Yeah.
This is an example of a laced canvas that was later lined and then attached to, this is the tacking edge, and attached to that edge with rosehead hand-forged tacks. And the next slide shows you tack holes, but here is a lace hole. And this is very hard to find examples of this because many of the paintings, they cut the tacking edges away. The tacking edge itself reflects the development of this canvas and the development of tacks to hold the canvas. So a tacking edge holds tacks, the way you attach it to the stretcher. Here is a painting that was treated as if it was a paper object. It was put in a frame, unstretched, and this is what happens to it. It becomes, it distorts, and it actually forms this kind of flaking. And in the 19th century, they developed all kinds of stretchers to deal with cracking of canvas and so on. This is a Hudson River panel back stretcher that was very popular with the Hudson River School, Frederick Church, Thomas Cole. These large paintings, the reason they have survived and are such good condition is because of this panel back stretcher that was developed in the 19th century. Next slide. And this may be one of the manufacturers of it, and it is in the 19th century that we see the development of the middleman, the artist material supplier, also called the artist colorman. In the 19th century, they used the term artist colorman. This is a looking glass manufacturer. What is a looking glass manufacturer? Anybody?
Mirror.
A mirror. So that would be a pier mirror by a looking glass manufacturer, which is this fellow here, Louis P. Clover from 1820. And he not only made pier mirrors, but he may have also made stretchers, because there was an invoice that was in Thomas Cole's collection that indicated that he manufactured stretchers for Thomas Cole. And here we have, by 1880, a sewing machine manufacturer that is making panel stretchers, a panel that's attached to a stretcher, that are as big as 6 by 8 feet.
Wow.
Okay? And the reason the sewing machine manufacturer is made, because he's made these sewing machine tables with very fine mahogany veneers, which is very smooth, and so he decided that artists might also want a typical panel that way. E.F. French is his name. And then we have here Shattuck. So many of the artists developed different kinds of systems to expand the corners of stretchers. And here's an example of Shattuck's keys, metal keys. By 1900, over 1 million of those were sold by the Weber company. Now, I also want to pass around lapis lazuli, and notice the difference between the two here. You can see how blue these are, but if you look at these other samples of lapis, you can see the impurities in the stone, the gray material. So there are all different grades of lapis. There's also malachite there, and
But we use malachite for pigment also?
I think possibly for green pigment, yes. So, and here is Shattuck's patent. Aaron D. Shattuck was part of the Hudson River School, and this is 1885. And again, you can see what he's doing here. Now, I also want to show you, and I'm pass this around, the brushes. Everybody assumes that the brushes you use today are the same brushes that artists always use. Well, in the 1700s, what were the brushes made out of? The brushes were made out of quill with the hair bound to the quill, which creates these rounds, not a flat, but a round, and also bound with wire or thread and so on. So this goes into, this is DeVoe, who's a 19th century colorman, and the term color, no, did you pass it over? The 19th century colorman would stretch and prime canvas. They would also grind colors and sell pigment. This was a very small industry, because you have to remember, when was the Metropolitan Museum of Art formed? 1870. What was the museum in New York? It was the New York Historical Society. And then I want to show you the introduction of the metal ferrule. When was that? So the quill and binding of it is in the 19th century, in the early 19th century. So by creating a metal ferrule, it created more strength to the brush. The brush could be taken out on site and do landscape paintings on site. And by crimping the round part of the brush, this is from Cropsey's paint box, you can see by crimping it, you actually make a flat. So here is a filbert, and if it was a round, if it was a round ferrule, it would be a round brush. But by crimping the corner, the edge of it, it actually makes a filbert or a flat. So why am I talking about this? Why do you think I'm talking about it? Because of France.
Yeah.
Okay, and what was the famous stroke that the French Impressionists created in the 1820s and 30s, 1830s I think mostly.
35.
Yeah, 35. It was called the tache, T-A-C-H-E. And the tache was possible because of the crimping of the metal ferrule to create a flat bristle brush.
So tache in French is actually literally, the translation is a spot. So that's, if I may...
Yes, please.
So first of all, from my knowledge, it's interesting, he's showing you a filbert. So he didn't go from what I know, you may know differently, but he didn't go from round to flat. Actually, the first flatter brush was a filbert, which is sort of in between. So round.
Yes, that's why I showed that.
Yeah, but it's interesting to know. So there was that filler. That
Yes,
tache
exactly.
move was done with a filbert
What-
because they could. It was two brush in one, and this corresponds because I have in my I've done a book and different lectures and stuff about how to play the game about the influence of art supplies. Certain of those colorman, that I know, some part of family of mine, is that it's thanks to the material, the invention, whether it's the pigment, whether it's the brush, whether it's the stretch canvas that have influence, opened the door for the impressionist to let go and like
create
the tache, because before the tache was one, the bright color was another.
Right.
So the influence of the
artificial-
material,
Right.
we take credit, sort of some credit to have helped the impressionists to break the mold from the academy. No? Does that make sense?
Yes, it makes a lot of sense. And it also makes sense because the artists at the turn of the 19th century, in other words, 1780s to about 1810, were starting to move out of the studios and doing paintings on site, landscape, plein air paintings basically. And it is these inventions that allowed artists to move out of their studio. And one such invention was the development of the metal tube. Now, Winsor Newton loves to take credit, and they did patent in 1840. Before this patent, how was pigment held? It was held in bladders, in leather. And the problem with the leather pouches is that the leather would eventually dry and crack, and then the pigment would dry out. So Winsor Newton was trying to develop with a syringe method, a tube where the pigment wouldn't dry. And this is 1840. And by the way, Winsor Newton was founded around that time. It was one of the later colormen, not one of the earlier ones. But it's not Winsor Newton's patent that created the collapsible paint tube. It is this patent, which is the collapsible paint tube, and that was done by John G. Rand, an American artist who did portraiture from North Carolina, and here is the British patent of the first collapsible paint tube. And if you go back to this image, this tube is, the cap of that tube is not a screw cap, but it is just a cap that is held in place there. And it is that cap, that patent, that Winsor Newton either acquires, and so the first catalog of Winsor Newton talks about Rand's patent collapsible paint tube. That's the first one when they first started production. 5 years later, the next catalog, and I've seen this myself, talks about Winsor Newton collapsible paint tube, and Rand's name is no longer mentioned.
So there is, the French and the English always have
Yes.
a little battle.
Yes.
So yes, from my understanding, so definitely the American who invented the tube for painting, but it was a pre-invention from American also. It was also for the army, to have some medicine or to have some things.
Right.
So then he was smart to use it for painting.
Right.
And then in England, the first parliament didn't have that screw cap.
Right.
There is some that argue, and there is even a book about that, that they are the French, it was Lefranc, who invented the screw.
Oh, that's possible. That is very possible.
And that's
Yes, that is very possible because it comes later.
Yeah. So the fact to close it like that, that was the
So
first.
why am I emphasizing this collapsible paint tube? Because it suddenly allows artists to travel west, to travel up the Hudson River, to bring their paint supplies with them. And so you see in the catalogs, this is from Goupil and Company, and you can see this is about 1845, a typical, and this shows you the new equipment that the artist is using. So when you think of Thomas Cole and the Oxbow painting that's in the Met, and you see the artist in the painting, there's this beautiful large landscape, and on the little rock, there's the artist there with an easel, and he has an umbrella, and he's painting the painting, which is supposedly this painting, the Oxbow painting. Why do you think? Why do you think he put the artist himself in that painting? Because he was showing the viewing public that he was a modern artist with the latest portable artist material. So the French easel was invented in the 19th century. The umbrella, the little paint stool, all of that becomes very popular in the 19th century. Yes, Andrew?
Alex, when these tubes were invented, does that mean that artists stopped grinding their own?
Well, this is, you see, then this goes right to, thank you for that question, because it goes right to the development of watercolor in the late 1700s and the watercolor cakes. And so you can see here, these emblems indicate which colorman is actually making these watercolor cakes. This is the rise of the artist colorman or the art supply store. And the art supply store now was preparing pigments and canvas and the materials that the artist needed to paint. The bottega system, the Italian system, has faded out. It has dissolved, and what has replaced them is the rise of the artist colorman. So not that the colormen did anything wrong, because they actually provided a service for the artists in the 19th century that did not exist before. It made it easy for them. Yes, in the back.
So are you saying naturally, and then the colorman.
Yes, basically the system of indenturing young children into a bottega system was failing by the 1700s. There was a craft system that had been brought in from Northern Europe, and so basically this all changed the way artists and artist materials would develop.
So there was a progress in my understanding, and I'm not as educated as you, but it was a progression. So the bottega was one thing. Then after there was the artist, but it was, even you look at things from the Dutch school of art, it was usually more wealthy or people with some money who could afford to make the paint because they have their own adult assistant, so they would ground the paint on the spot, but it was not kids and stuff, it was a real, there was an assistant, it was the employee, so each painter had many employees. An employee who made the paint, the other one who stretched the canvas, who primed the linen on the canvas. So it was all, for that you had to either have a great person who give you a lot of money, or you'd be rich yourself, and then little by little, early 19th century, that those stores, and I know the story from probably the Chevalier, that's what I know, so I assume it was similar in England and other places. And then little by little, the store would start having product, but they were still mainly make paint to order. So you would go to the store and you would choose the color, they would have some kind of swatch book and say, okay, I'll grind you the paint, come back this afternoon or tomorrow, and you have the paint. And then when the tube started, they started to have ready-made tube, but it took a while, and the tube was much more expensive.
Yes.
So there were still people who would rather buy
and
the
also
paint.
people who prefer to work in the atelier, in the studio.
And it's interesting because you refer, it's normal because you're American. I'm American too now, but with my French background, we talk about painting today here. We said plein air. So the first plein air painter was Barbizon, near in the south of France. But it was very cumbersome. They didn't have the tube and things.
Right,
so
and they actually painted on paper, primed paper. So these were, in fact, if you go to the Pierpont Morgan or the Met, they have a collection of these early,
so they had some,
late 1700s,
so
early
they had those
1800s.
temporary painting. They would paint outside. They started the idea of painting outside, but they couldn't finish. And it's in the mid-19th century with exactly that you said, between the easel, the frame, the stretch canvas, the brushes, the pigment, and the tube, that started a new movement.
Okay, so I have to move on. So the other introduction was the introduction of portable materials, and if you paint on canvas, you know that a stretcher can be heavy, and that when you travel, it's very hard to travel with a lot of canvases. They're bulky, so what they developed in the 19th century is what we call academy boards, because at the same time, at the turn of in the early 1800s, was the introduction of academies where the gentlemen and ladies were taught painting because that was considered part of their education. So they developed an inexpensive board, a mill board or a academy board that could be used in these schools to learn how to paint. And these became very popular boards because they basically were a cardboard that was sized and primed on both sides. This gray ground is actually a sizing, and the problem is what happens with the ground if it gets wet in any way. It causes this kind of flaking that you see there. But because they were so portable, they could fit into a little traveling academy board box, and you could have 3 or 4 different panels. This is the same thing that is going on with the dye bond panel. Here is a Raymark panel that is copper coated, but these little portable panels, many artists are putting canvas on them, and you can paint on them. They're very portable, and they also, you can pass that around. And here's another kind of support that was developed in about 15 years ago. So Academy boards and the Japan boxes were introduced. You can see the thumb box sketch box, and this is very appropriate for the Salmagundi Club, because in 1908 was the first thumb box exhibition in this club. I know we only have a few minutes, so I have to go on. So here is a thumb box, and you can go downstairs in the dining room in the hallway, and you can see some of these thumb box paintings. Here is Gifford painting on site in 1857, and here is the introduction of portable things. And this is some of the markings that you can find, stencil marks, and you can see that this is an artist colorman supplying drawing materials, pictures, and print dealer. So they weren't only providing materials. Goupil and Company, artist colorman on Broadway, was actually became Nobler Galleries and also sold artwork. And William Schaus was one of the early people that were involved with Nobler. The earliest American colorman is Edward Deschaux from France, and his firm comes in about 1836, and this is a later mark from the 40s, and you can date these canvases by these marks, and I actually did a reference book that relates to it. I'm going to stop here because I'm really running over time, but this is an American painting, and I wanted to show you the typical tension cracking that occurs over time. This was a painting that was stored in a damp environment, and very quickly they poked at the eyes, which is why it created that sigmoid type cracking, the coil cracking, and I'm going to go through it. This is rift drying cracks, in other words, an additive to the paint to create the darks to dry quicker, and it actually caused a cracking. And the loss is there, and then this is it afterwards. Notice that I didn't in-paint that cracking because that's part of the history of the paint. So I'm going to end it here, and thank you very much for all coming. I hope if you have any other questions, I'll be happy to answer them.